At minus 30 degrees, you lie in ruins buried among rubble. It's been 2 days since the gunfire stopped, but Soviet soldiers could knock on your door at any moment. Your body has already started freezing. You ate the last breadcrumb in your stomach yesterday morning, and your friends are dying one by one. The marshal is begging Hitler over the radio, asking for permission to retreat, but the only order coming from Berlin is fight to the last man. You know that if you surrender, you'll go to Siberia, and there most soldiers will die from freezing or starvation. Should you think about suicide, or should you surrender and try to survive? So what would you have done if you were there? Before we begin the video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share in the comments which historical event you'd like us to cover. So now, let's go together into the hell of Stalingrad, to this horror experienced through the eyes of a German soldier. Chapter 1. Final Days. Inside the Siege. On the morning of November 19th, 1942, on the western bank of the Volga River, the first thing you heard when you woke in the basement of a destroyed factory was artillery fire. But this time the sounds were coming from an unusual direction because Soviet cannons were firing not from the south of the city, but from the north and west. Klaus, lying next to you, immediately sat up straight and hit the ceiling beams, cursing hoarsely while rubbing his head. But you were already on your feet. When you went outside, you noticed the sky glowing in a hazy red tone, snowflakes falling rapidly to the ground. Winter had come early to Stalingrad, and would condemn you, along with the 6th Army's 250,000 soldiers, to deliberate cold. As Commander Lieutenant Werner's voice echoed from the basement stairs, you hastily grabbed your weapon. He was saying, the Russians have launched a major attack in the north. The Romanian lines had collapsed, but the panic in his voice hadn't fully settled yet. In those days, you still thought this was a temporary situation, that the Soviets would be repelled as always. Because for months you had been capturing Stalingrad meter by meter. You had reached the banks of the Volga, controlled 90% of the city. Only a few ruined buildings should have remained. However, the expression on Werner's face indicated that something was going very wrong. In the afternoon, the news got even worse. The Soviets had attacked not only from the north, but also from the south, and were crushing Romanian and Italian forces. Radio operator Eric, looking at the paper in his hand, spoke stuttering as if he couldn't believe the words he was saying. The Russians' aim was to accomplish encirclement, to completely surround the 6th Army. The commander's face turned white. Your stomach felt heavy as if it had fallen into emptiness for a moment. Encirclement meant isolation. No help, no supplies, no escape route. 3 days later, on the evening of November 23rd, 1942, the worst news came. Soviet units had met at the town of Kalak, and the circle had completely closed. You were now part of an army trapped in Stalingrad. Though worried at first, you remember commanders trying to reassure you. Marshal Paulus had asked Berlin for permission to retreat, but Hitler's answer was clear, definite, and indisputable. You would stay in Stalingrad to the last man, the last bullet. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, however, promised that the Luftwaffe could provide sufficient supplies daily, that the army could be fed by air. These words had reassured you because you trusted the German Air Force. The first weeks of December passed between hope and hopelessness. An average of 90 tons of supplies came daily, but the army's need was at least 750 tons. Rations began decreasing. The bread slice you received in the mornings was getting thinner. The meat pieces in your lunch soup were completely disappearing. While you ate 3 meals a day at the end of November, by mid-December, you started receiving 1 slice of bread in the morning, a watery soup in the evening. Klaus went to bed hungry every night, his stomach complaining with noises, but no one made a sound because everyone's situation was the same. The cold was intensifying with each passing day. When the temperature dropped to -20 degrees, your winter clothes still hadn't arrived. You wore everything you could find over your summer uniforms. Coats from dead friends, torn blankets, even furs taken from Russian soldiers. The boots on your feet had cracked. Frostbite had started on your fingers. But you couldn't go to the doctor because even seriously wounded couldn't receive treatment. There was no medicine. Bandages were depleted. Surgical instruments had frozen. Toward the end of December, when von Manstein's rescue operation began, a glimmer of hope had appeared. An army coming from outside was trying to break through the siege. Approaching you had come as close as 48 kilometers to you. In those days, you were all ready. As soon as the order came, you would break out of the trap and unite with Manstein's forces. However, Hitler again forbade retreat. Paulus couldn't act. Manstein withdrew, understanding he couldn't stay alone. That night, everyone in the basement sank into silence, because you understood you wouldn't be rescued. In the first days of January 1943, Klaus died. When you woke in the morning, you noticed your friend lying next to you had grown cold. His eyes were open, but his gaze was blank. His body had stiffened like stone. He wasn't wounded, nor did he appear sick. He had just fallen asleep, then died freezing. You carried him to the side of the basement stairs, covered him with a blanket, but couldn't bury him because the ground was frozen. Dozens, hundreds of corpses were starting to pile up around. You no longer even counted the dead. Hunger had reached such a point that some soldiers were cutting up and eating dead horses. You tried making soup from leather pieces, even used frozen breadcrumbs. Your stomach constantly ached, your head spun. There was no strength left in your legs. Once while walking, your foot tripped. You fell to the ground, but you had to wait 5 minutes to get up because there was no energy left in your body. When Werner grabbed your arm and lifted you, you noticed how sunken your eyes had become. The bones in your cheek were jutting out sharply under the skin. The ammunition situation was also disastrous. By mid-January, 5 bullets per soldier per day were allocated. Machine guns had fallen silent because there were no more bullets. When the Soviets attacked, you could only respond with your rifle, being careful that each bullet didn't go to waste. One day, the Russians charged the factory's eastern wing. You had 3 bullets left in your hand. With the first 2, you shot 2 enemy soldiers, but before using the third, the Soviets retreated. You protected that bullet, as if clinging to it, because you knew it could save your life in the next attack. On January 24th, 1943, the last airfield fell into Soviet hands. Now no plane could land, no wounded could be evacuated, no supplies could come. That night, one of the soldiers in the basement began crying silently, but no one tried to console him. Everyone had the same despair inside, the same fear of death. Werner read aloud the order that came over the radio. The 6th Army will resist to the last man. However, you no longer had the strength to resist. Days started blurring together. You couldn't tell whether it was morning or evening anymore, because the sky was constantly gray, the air constantly cold. There was constant hunger in your stomach. Some nights you saw your home in Germany in your dreams. Your mother's cabbage soup, the living room where your father smoked, your brother's laughing face as he went to school. Then you woke up, remembered the corpses around you, the frozen hands and feet, the smell of blood. You could no longer distinguish dream from reality. Toward the end of January, Paulus once again asked Hitler for permission. Either you had to surrender, or you would be completely destroyed. On January 30th, Hitler answered, but what he gave wasn't permission, but promotion. He elevated Paulus to field marshal, because no German field marshal had ever been captured before. Thus, Paulus was expected either to fight or commit suicide. However, Paulus had found neither the strength to fight nor the courage to commit suicide. On January 31st, 1943, when Soviet soldiers knocked on headquarters' door, the field marshal surrendered. You were still in the factory basement. Werner had put down his weapon. Other soldiers, too. When Soviet soldiers came, hands went up in the air, knees knelt, heads bowed. You were no longer a German soldier. You were a prisoner of war. When you were taken outside, you faced the ruins of Stalingrad. Everything was destroyed, ash-colored, smelling of death. Thousands of soldiers were gathering in the streets, all hungry, all exhausted, all hopeless. A Soviet commander shouted something, but you didn't know Russian. Then you understood. You would start walking. You didn't know where you were going, but you had a feeling inside. A bad feeling. You had heard the name Siberia before, had heard of other prisoner camps. Maybe you would never return to Germany. You started walking. Snow was falling. Wind was cutting. Cold was seeping into your bones. When you turned and looked back, you saw the factory ruins. There, Klaus had died. There, dozens of your friends had perished. Their hope had been extinguished. Now before you was an uncertain future, an unknown journey. Your feet were barely moving, but you knew if you stopped, Soviet soldiers would point their guns at you. You wanted to live. You still wanted to live. Chapter 2, Surrender Day. On the morning of February 2nd, 1943, Stalingrad's streets had completely fallen silent. The roar of cannons had stopped. Gunfire had ceased. Only the howling the wind made among the ruins was heard. At midnight, the last message had come over the radio. The 6th Army was surrendering. No one among the soldiers in the basement had spoken. No one had cried. No one had felt anything because you no longer even had the strength to feel. Werner had put his weapon on the ground, put his head in his hands, just sat there. You had leaned against the wall and closed your eyes, but couldn't sleep because your mind kept asking the same question. What would happen now? With the morning's first light, Soviet soldiers came. You remember swallowing when the sound of boots descending the stairs broke the silence in the basement. Your heart had started beating. Your hands were trembling. Perhaps they would kill you, you had thought. However, the arriving soldiers didn't fire. The commander was a short, broad-shouldered man with deep lines on his face. His eyes were tired. He shouted something in Russian, raised his hand, pointed at your weapons. The time to surrender had come. Werner first took out his pistol, slowly put it on the ground. Other soldiers followed him. You were the last to release your rifle from your hand. Because that weapon had been with you for months, you had fought with it, survived, lost friends. When the coldness of metal withdrew from your fingers, you felt an emptiness. You had nothing left to protect. The Soviet soldier approached, turned you toward the wall, searched you, took even the last breadcrumb in your pocket, then pushed you up the stairs. When you went outside, the sun blinded your eyes. You had been in the basement for weeks, weren't accustomed to natural light. When you squinted and looked around, you saw Stalingrad's true state. The city had completely vanished. Buildings had turned into piles of rubble. Corpses were piling up in the streets. Tank wrecks were rusting under snow. In the square in front of the factory, hundreds of German soldiers had gathered, all hungry like you, all exhausted like you, all prisoners like you. Soviet soldiers had lined you up in rows. The wounded couldn't walk. Some were crawling on the ground. Some were holding on to friends' shoulders. The man standing on your right had lost his leg. In place of his left leg was a bloody bandage. His face was white, his eyes half closed. You wanted to support him, but you didn't even have the strength to keep yourself standing. The man swayed forward, collapsed to the ground. No one helped him. Soviet soldiers left him there because those who couldn't walk would be killed. The number of soldiers gathered in the square had reached thousands. Some were crying, some were praying, some were just staring blankly. You lost Werner in the crowd. Those around you were unfamiliar faces. You were alone. A Soviet commander climbed onto a platform, began speaking through a megaphone. He was speaking Russian, but you understood from his tone he was commanding. A translator came forward, began translating into German. As prisoners of war, you would be taken to camps. Those who didn't obey rules would be punished. Those who tried to escape would be shot. When you started walking, it was past noon. In columns, at gunpoint of Soviet soldiers, you left Stalingrad's ruins. Snow was knee-deep, your feet were sinking into it. Your boots were taking in snow through holes. The cold was so intense that with each breath your chest hurt, your lungs burned. Around you soldiers were walking, but no one was talking. Only the crunch boots made in snow, the howling of wind were heard. In the first hour, dozens of soldiers collapsed to the ground. Some from hunger, some from cold, some just because they had no strength left to walk. Soviet soldiers weren't shooting those who stopped, but they weren't picking them up either. They left them there, continued walking. Once, when you turned around, you saw dozens of corpses left in snow at the roadside. These hadn't died in battle. They were dying in peacetime, after surrendering. In the late afternoon, you arrived at the first collection camp. This was a temporary camp, set up outside Stalingrad, on flat terrain. It was surrounded by barbed wire. In the center was a large area. Wooden huts were visible around it, but most of the huts had collapsed. They directed you to the area in the center. Thousands of soldiers were waiting outdoors, under snowfall. There was no place to sit, no building to shelter in, just bare ground. When evening darkness fell, you were still standing. Your legs weren't holding. Your knees were buckling. But you knew if you sat down, you would freeze. Soldiers around you were also trying to stay on their feet like you. Some had huddled together, were trying to warm with body heat. You also approached a group, squeezed among them, but you were still cold. The temperature was below -30 degrees. You didn't feel your fingers, there was pain in your toes. Your ears had frozen. At midnight, food was distributed. Soviet soldiers brought large cauldrons. Inside was watery soup. You got in line, received a ladle of soup in your tin cup. The soup was cold. There was nothing in it. It was just like cloudy water, but you drank it because you hadn't put anything in your stomach for days. Bread was also distributed. A hard, moldy, frozen slice of bread. But you ate that too. Your stomach immediately cramped. You felt like vomiting, but you held on because if you vomited, you would be hungry again. When you looked around, you noticed some soldiers didn't even have the strength to get food. They were lying on the ground, eyes half open, not breathing. Soviet soldiers passing by were checking them, dragging the dead to the side. Corpses were piling up in heaps. When you counted at first light in the morning, there were at least 100 corpses in one corner of the camp. These hadn't died in battle. After becoming prisoners, in just one day, they had died. The second day was even harder. When the sun rose in the morning, you saw new corpses around you. There were those who had died freezing during the night. There was no feeling left in your toes either. Your left foot was completely numb, but you were still standing. You had looked for Werner in the crowd, but couldn't find him. Maybe he had died. Maybe he was in another camp. Maybe he had been left on the road. You didn't know. In the afternoon, soldiers started being counted. Soviet officers came, took notes in ledgers, divided soldiers into groups. The wounded to one side, the sick to one side, those who could walk to one side. You were in the group that could walk. An officer approached, looked at your face, checked your hands, looked for signs of frostbite. He saw blackness on your fingers, frowned, said something, but you didn't understand. He left you in the walking group. The wounded group was taken to a far corner of the camp. There was a wooden hut there. Its roof was half collapsed. Its walls were cracked, but at least inside you could be protected from the wind. The wounded piled in there. Some had no leg, some had lost an arm, some had bullet wounds in their chest. There was no doctor, no medicine, no bandage, only screams, groans, the smell of death. At night, sounds from that hut were heard throughout the camp, but when morning came, sounds had stopped. When you looked through the hut's door, you saw almost everyone had died. On the third day, a new order came. You would be loaded onto trains. They didn't say where you would go, but camp elders were whispering, saying Siberia. This word had frozen on your lips. Siberia, the coldest place in the world, where Soviet forced labor camps were located, the place from which most prisoners never returned. You were afraid, but at the same time there was also hope, because if you stayed here, you would surely die. In the afternoon, trains came to the camp. These weren't passenger trains. They were freight cars. Doors wide, no windows, wooden walls, floors covered with filth. Soviet soldiers divided you into groups. They were cramming 50 to 60 people into a car for 30. You were pushed from behind, fell into the car. Others fell on top of you. You tried to stand up, but there was no room. Everyone had leaned against each other. No one could move. When the car door closed, darkness fell. There were no windows, no air holes, only thin light coming through cracks in the wooden walls. Breathing was difficult because the air was dirty, oxygen scarce. Around was body odor, smell of filth, smell of death. The man standing next to you was coughing. Rattles were coming from his chest, probably pneumonia. On the other side, a young soldier was crying silently, calling for his mother. When the train moved, you swayed, hit the man in front of you. He hit someone else. The car's floor was cold. Walls were frozen. Snow was seeping from the ceiling. Your feet were numb. Your back ached. Your stomach was empty. You didn't know how many hours you would travel. You didn't know how many days it would last. You didn't know where you were going. There was only one thing you knew. You had to survive. You wouldn't give up yet. You hadn't died in Stalingrad. You wouldn't die in this car either. You would live. You would definitely live. Chapter 3. Journey to Siberia. The first hours after the train started moving passed in uncertainty. The darkness inside the car was so dense that even if you held your hand in front of your eyes, you couldn't see it. You could only hear the sounds of breathing around you. Coughs, groans. The car's floor was cold iron. It wasn't possible to sit on it, because in a few minutes you were freezing. You were trying to stand, but the space was so tight you couldn't open your legs properly. Soldiers around you were trying to maintain balance like you, swaying right and left, leaning against each other. The first night, no one could sleep. The cold was so intense that your body constantly shivered. Your teeth chattered. Your muscles contracted. When you breathed, Your chest hurt. The old soldier standing next to you had grabbed your arm, was trying to benefit from body heat. You had also leaned on him because you couldn't stand alone. By holding on to each other, with each other's warmth, you were trying to survive. At midnight, a sound like a trumpet was heard. Someone in the back corner of the car had started coughing. The cough was getting more intense. Then he seemed to be choking. When morning came, that sound had stopped. The first death had come on the first day of the journey. On the morning of the second day, when sun seeped through the cracks in the car's wooden walls, you could see around you. The scene was terrible. 50 to 60 people piled on top of each other. Some standing, some squatting, some lying on the ground, waiting. In one corner of the car was a bucket used in place of a toilet, but the bucket had long overflowed. Filth had flowed to the ground. The area was filled with a terrible smell. Some soldiers were no longer using the bucket, were doing it directly in the corner, because to reach the bucket, you had to pass over people. Toward noon, the train stopped. When the door opened, blinding light came. Fresh air flowed from outside. You all tried to breathe. Soviet soldiers ordered. You had to get off the car. You tried to move your feet, but your legs didn't hold. Your knees didn't bend. You would collapse to the ground. The man in front of you caught you, pulled you by the arm, threw you out of the car. You fell onto a pile of snow. When you looked around, you noticed the train had stopped in a desolate terrain. Around were only snowy plains, pine forests in the distance. An endless whiteness. Soviet soldiers lined you up in rows. It was mealtime. A ladle of watery soup from large cauldrons. A slice of black bread was distributed. While drinking the soup, the tin cup you held in your hand trembled because your fingers had frozen. You tried to bite the bread, but the bread was hard as stone. Frozen, your teeth would break. You waited for it to soften in your mouth, then slowly swallowed. The break lasted only 15 minutes. The Soviet officer blew a whistle. You were ordered to board the cars again. This time, you squeezed into a place near the door because you didn't want to die inside the car. When the door closed, darkness fell again. But this time, thin light was seeping through the spaces between the boards. You held on there, tried to console yourself by looking at that light. On the third day, the car's atmosphere had changed. No one was talking anymore. Coughs had increased. Groans had risen. Some soldiers had begun deliriously rambling unconsciously. The young soldier in the back corner was saying his mother's name, shouting that he wanted to go home. The old man next to him was trying to quiet him, but the young man wouldn't stop. It continued like this for hours. Then the young man's voice stopped. By evening, he had died. He was the second death. You don't remember the fourth day exactly. You had lost the concept of time because night and day had blurred together. Every moment was filled with the same darkness, the same cold, the same pain. You only waited for the moments when the train stopped. At those breaks, you could go outside, breathe, get food. However, at each break, corpses were being removed from your car. Soviet soldiers would open the door, have the dead counted, order them thrown out. You piled the corpses at the side of the train tracks. You didn't bury them because the ground was frozen. On the fifth day, hunger had become unbearable. Your stomach was so empty it had started cramping. Though you had nothing to vomit, you were retching. Your head was spinning. Darkness was coming before your eyes. You had leaned against the car's wall, closed your eyes, were waiting for death. Maybe dying here was better, you thought. What would happen in Siberia anyway? There too you would starve, freeze, be worked. Maybe dying here was easier. However, When the train stopped, you got up again. Your body had gone into autopilot mode. The brain was giving commands. The body was obeying. When you went outside, this time, the scenery was a bit different. There were trees around. Snowy hills were visible. A different cold was felt in the air. A sharper, more merciless, more deadly cold. You understood you were approaching Siberia. On the night of the 6th day, panic began inside the car. A soldier had started screaming, saying he couldn't breathe. The air was very dirty, oxygen very scarce. Breathing had really become difficult. The man ran to the car door, started pounding the boards with his fists, shouted, "Open it!" But no one opened. Other soldiers tried to calm him, but the man had gone mad. It continued like this for hours. When morning came, the man had curled up in the corner, had fallen silent. You didn't know if he had died or was just exhausted. On the 7th day, the train made a longer stop. When you got off the car, you saw a town around you. Small wooden houses, smoky chimneys, snowy streets. You had arrived in Siberia. The townspeople were watching you. Women were looking from windows. Children standing in streets were observing. You couldn't tell whether there was fear or pity on their faces. Perhaps there was both. At this stop, only water was given instead of food. Soviet soldiers brought large buckets. You were told to drink in turn. The water was ice cold. When you took it in your mouth, your teeth ached, but you drank because you had been dying of thirst for days. Some soldiers drank too fast. Their stomachs couldn't handle it. They vomited. You tried to drink, slowly sipping. While returning to the cars, some soldiers tried to escape. 2 young soldiers ran into a side street. But before taking 3 steps, Soviet soldiers fired. One was hit in the head, immediately collapsed to the ground. The other was shot in the leg, fell to the ground, began screaming. A Soviet soldier approached, shot another bullet in his head. The scream stopped. They left the corpses there. You were loaded onto the cars again. No one was thinking about escaping anymore. On the 8th day, the train didn't travel during the day. You waited at the station, stood there for hours. Time didn't seem to pass inside the car. Some soldiers were sleeping, some were just staring, some were praying inside. You were looking at light seeping through windows. Outside, snow was falling. Flakes were falling heavily, landing gently on the ground. It was actually beautiful. It reminded of winter days in Germany. But then you remembered the smell inside the car, remembered the dead around, remembered how you came here. On the 9th day, the train stopped for the last time. When the door opened, a Soviet officer shouted, "You had arrived. Your camp was here." While getting off the car, your legs didn't hold. You fell to the ground. Soldiers around you were also collapsing to the ground like you. Couldn't stand up. For 9 days you had been squeezed in a tight space. Couldn't move. Your muscles had atrophied. When you looked around, you saw the camp. It was surrounded by barbed wire. Inside, wooden barracks were lined up. The barracks' roofs had collapsed. Walls were cracked. Windows were broken. In the center of the camp was a large, square towers, were visible around it. At the tops of the towers, Soviet soldiers were waiting, machine guns in their hands. When you entered through the camp gate, you noticed the cold. It was colder than Stalingrad. It must have been -40 degrees. When you breathed, the inside of your nose froze. Your eyelashes iced over. Around you, soldiers were walking, but no one was talking. Only the sound boots made in snow was heard. You were directed to barracks. 150 to 200 people were crammed into each barrack. Inside were wooden bunks, but there was no straw on the bunks, no blanket, no pillow, only bare wood. The walls were riddled with holes. Wind was coming in, cold was seeping into bones. When night came, you lay down on the bunk. The wood was cold, hard, painful. The soldier lying next to you was coughing. Rattles were coming from his chest. On the bunk above you, another soldier was groaning. Around everywhere was disease, everywhere pain, everywhere death. You closed your eyes and thought of Germany. Maybe one day you would return. Maybe one day you would wake from this nightmare. Maybe one day you would be free. But maybe you would die here. Maybe Siberia's glaciers would be your grave. You didn't know. No one knew. Chapter 4. Survival Struggle in Gulag Camp. The first morning you woke, with the whistle sound rising from the camp's loudspeakers. Outside was still dark. The sun hadn't risen, but you had to get up. Soldiers around you were getting down from bunks, walking trembling from cold toward the barrack door. You followed them too. When you got down from the wood, you felt the pain in your feet. There was no feeling in your fingers. Your left foot was completely numb. Walking was painful, but you couldn't stop because those who stayed behind were beaten. Outside, the air was -40 degrees. When you breathed, your chest burned. The inside of your nose froze. Ice crystals formed around your eyes. In the camp square, thousands of prisoners were lined up. Soviet officers came, did the count, determined groups. Your group would be sent to the forest. Tree cutting work was assigned. Axes were distributed. A Soviet soldier would accompany your group. Escapees would be shot. While walking toward the forest, snow had risen to knee height. With each step you were sinking, expending force to get out, getting tired. The group was advancing slowly, because most soldiers didn't even have the strength to walk. Some were collapsing to the ground on the road. Soviet soldiers were kicking them, but the man couldn't get up. Finally, they finished the job with a bullet, left the corpse in the snow pile. When you arrived at the forest, the sun had risen, but the air hadn't warmed. The Soviet commander pointed to a tree, ordered you to cut it. You took the axe, approached the tree, struck the first blow. Your hand was so frozen you couldn't hold the axe properly. On the second blow, the axe slipped from your hand, fell to the ground. The commander shouted. You took the axe again. This time, tried to hold tighter. You cut trees for hours. Your arms had tired. Your shoulders had started aching. Your back had cramped. No break was given. No water was given. You were only ordered to continue cutting. Toward noon, someone from the group collapsed to the ground. He had a heart attack. The commander approached, checked the man, but the man had died. They dragged the corpse to the side. You continued working. When you returned to camp in the evening, the sun had set. It was mealtime. Large cauldrons stood in front of the barrack. Inside was watery soup. You got in line, received a ladle of soup in your tin cup. While drinking the soup, you couldn't taste anything because your tongue was frozen. Bread was also distributed. A 200-gram slice, black, moldy. You bit the bread, tried to chew in your mouth, but it was so hard your teeth hurt. Still, you ate because there was nothing else. When you returned to the barrack at night, you lay on your bunk. Your body was so tired you couldn't move. Your muscles had cramped, joints ached, lungs burned. The soldier lying next to you was coughing. His cough was dry. Hoarse, strange sounds came from his chest. You wanted to say something to him, but you had no strength to speak. You closed your eyes and tried to sleep. In the second week, diseases began. Typhus had broken out in the barrack. Initial symptoms were fever, headache, trembling. Then rashes appeared on the body. The person started going mad, finally died. The soldier lying next to you had gotten sick. All night he was delirious, calling his mother, saying he wanted to go home. When morning came, he had died. They carried the corpse outside the barrack, piled it with other corpses. In the third week, a dysentery epidemic came. It started with uncontrollable diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration. People were losing kilos in hours, drying up, dying. Toilets were insufficient. Most soldiers were doing it inside the barrack. Filth was flowing to the ground. The epidemic was spreading. The area was filled with a terrible smell. They weren't separating the sick because there was no place to separate them. You were all living in the same barrack, with the same diseases, in the same filth. In the fourth week, problems began with your toes, too. 3 toes of your left foot had completely blackened, had lost feeling. It was a frostbite case. There was a doctor in the camp, but no medicine, no bandage, no surgical instrument. The doctor looked at your finger, shook his head, said, "We may need to cut it," but he couldn't cut because there was no tool. They left the fingers as is. They continued rotting. As months passed, the camp's routine continued. Every morning you woke with a whistle. Roll call was done. You were sent to work. Sometimes to the forest, sometimes to the mine, sometimes to railroad construction you were directed. Work was always hard. Hours were always long. Food was always insufficient. In the evenings, when you returned to the barrack, you saw new corpses. Every day, dozens, sometimes hundreds of people were dying. In winter months, the cold reached unbearable dimensions. When the temperature dropped to -50 degrees, going outside was like committing suicide. However, you had to go to work. Soviet soldiers were loading you onto trucks, taking you to the forest depths, leaving you there. You were cutting trees, but you had no strength left to hold the axe. Your fingers were frozen, your feet were numb, your face was iced over. Some soldiers were sitting at the base of the tree, closing their eyes, waiting for death. Soviet soldiers were trying to wake them, but most weren't waking. They were dying frozen. When spring came, the number of survivors had halved. Of the 90,000 prisoners who came from Stalingrad, 40,000 had died in the first winter months. Corpses had been piled outside the camp, remained under snow. When spring came and snows melted, corpses appeared. Thousands of bodies, frozen faces, open eyes, had surrounded the camp. In summer months, things lightened a bit. The weather warmed, cold decreased, but heat brought other problems. Corpses began rotting. Mosquitoes bred. New diseases appeared. A malaria epidemic began, with symptoms of fever, trembling, hallucination. People were getting sick, dying without treatment. You also got sick. For days you lay with high fever, were delirious, thought you were talking with your mother. However, somehow you got through it. The body resisted. The disease passed. You survived. Toward the end of 1944, news began coming that the war was ending. Germans were retreating. Soviets were approaching Berlin. Victory was near. Hope sprouted in the camp. Maybe when the war ended, you would be released. Maybe you could go home. However, when the war ended in May 1945, nothing changed. Doors didn't open. Prisoners weren't released. Only the camp's name changed. You were no longer a prisoner of war camp. You were a forced labor camp. 2 more years passed. 1945. 1946, 1947 had blurred together. Every day was the same routine. Wake up, be counted, work, eat, sleep, die. Around you, people were dying. New ones were coming in their place. The camp's population was constantly changing. But you were still alive. You didn't know how you stayed alive. Maybe you were lucky. Maybe you were strong. Maybe death just hadn't taken you yet. Your friends had all died. You had lost Werner in Stalingrad. Klaus had died on the train. Soldiers lying in the barrack had gone one by one. You no longer remembered names. Faces had blurred. There were only numbers. 91,000 prisoners had come. 85,000 had died. Only 6,000 people would survive. At nights, while lying on your bunk, you thought, why did you survive? Why you? Why you and not others? There was no answer. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe fate, maybe it had no meaning at all. You were just alive, that's all. In 1948, a hope was born. Some prisoners had started being released. Those who weren't war criminals, those who adapted to the Soviet system, those who were sick, were being sent home. You didn't know if your name was on the list. You waited. Months passed. Your name wasn't called. Hope faded. However, you didn't give up. Every morning you woke. Every evening you survived. Siberia's cold, hunger, disease couldn't kill you. You were still resisting. You were still alive. Maybe one day you would return home. Maybe one day you would be free. Maybe one day this nightmare would end. You lived with that hope. That hope was keeping you upright. That hope was your only weapon. Chapter 5. 12 years later. Return or death. In the autumn of 1949, a change occurred in the camp. The German Democratic Republic had been established. Soviets had decided to release some prisoners. The first group consisted of 85,000 people. But you weren't in that group. From the barrack window, you watched soldiers boarding trucks. They were leaving. You were staying. You didn't know why you weren't chosen. Maybe your file was lost. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe you were just unlucky. When the trucks moved, you looked after them. Maybe one day your turn would come too, but your turn didn't come. 1950 came and went. You were still in the camp. 1951 too. You had lost the flow of time because every day, every month, every year was the same. Only seasons changed. Winter came, people froze. Spring came, snows melted, summer came, they got sick from heat. Autumn came, diseases spread. The cycle never stopped. You could now be considered old. You were 30 years old, but your body was like 60. Your hair had completely fallen out. Most of your teeth were broken or decayed. 3 toes of your left foot had long been cut off. Your back constantly ached. Your knees creaked. Your eyesight had weakened. When you looked in the mirror, you couldn't recognize yourself. Who was this man? Was this old, exhausted, sick man you? When you went to Stalingrad, you were a young soldier. Now you were a ghost. The camp's conditions had never changed. Every morning you woke with a whistle, were counted in the cold, were sent to work. They no longer sent you to the forest because you were old, weak, couldn't cut trees. Instead, you were assigned to jobs inside the camp, carrying corpses, cleaning toilets, washing dishes in the kitchen. These jobs were lighter, but humiliating. Once you were part of the German army, now you were cleaning filth. In the winter of 1952, half the camp caught an epidemic. It was a new disease. Symptoms were like typhus, but more deadly. People were dying within 3 days. Dozens of people in your barrack got sick. You also began fevering. Your body was trembling. Your head ached. Your vision blurred. This time you'll die, you thought. You had been alive for 9 years, but now your luck had run out. You lay on your bunk, closed your eyes, began waiting. However, again you didn't die. The disease lasted a week. Your body fought. Fever dropped. You came to yourself. When you got up, half the bunks around you were empty. Those men had died. You were alive. You no longer even knew the numbers. How many people had died? How many remained? In the camp now, there were 6,000 to 7,000 prisoners. What remained from 91,000? In March of 1953, Stalin died. When the news was announced over the camp's loudspeakers, some prisoners were silently pleased. Maybe the new leader would release prisoners. Maybe now they could go home. However, months passed. Nothing changed. Only the camp's commander changed. The new commander was harsher, more ruthless. Punishments were heavier. At nights, you no longer thought about Germany, because Germany no longer seemed real. It was like a dream, like a distant memory. Maybe it had never existed. Maybe you were always here, always in Siberia, always a prisoner. The past was erased. There was no future. There was only now. This moment, this breath, this second. In the summer of 1954, while working in the camp garden, you met a man. His name was Fritz. He was Austrian, had come from Stalingrad. Like you had been in camp for 11 years. You started talking. At first words came hard, because you hadn't spoken properly for years. You only listened to orders, said yes or no. However, Fritz was patient, listened to you. You told him about Stalingrad, told about the train, told about the first winter. He also told similar stories. You had experienced the same pains, seen the same losses, survived with the same miracle. Fritz told you something. He'd heard that West German Chancellor Adenauer would go to Moscow, would discuss the prisoner issue. Maybe an agreement would be made. Maybe the last prisoners would be released. At first, you didn't believe because for 12 years you had heard such rumors, but none had come true. However, Fritz insisted. This time was different. This time was serious. This time there was really hope. In September of 1955, hope became reality. The camp's commander came to the square. All prisoners gathered. An announcement was made. Adenauer and Khrushchev had reached an agreement. All remaining German prisoners would be released, would be sent to Germany. At first you didn't understand. Were you free? Could you really go? Soldiers around you began crying. Some shouted, some fainted. You just stood. You felt nothing. You hadn't felt for a very long time. In the first week of October, trucks came. Prisoners were gathered, counted, written on lists. Your name was there too. After 12 years, you were going home. While boarding the truck, you looked at the camp one last time. This place was where 12 years of your life passed. Here, thousands of your friends had died. Here, you, too, had almost died. However, you were alive. You were still breathing. You were still standing. This was the miracle. The train journey lasted a week. This time, the cars were different. They were passenger cars. There were windows. There were seats. Food was given. You could look outside. You were passing through Siberia's plains, arriving at cities, approaching the border. Every day you were getting a bit closer to Germany. You would never forget the moment you crossed the border. When the train stopped, Soviet soldiers got off. German officials boarded. Someone spoke in German. "Welcome. You're safe now. You're returning home." When you heard those sentences, your tears began flowing. After 12 years, you were crying for the first time. Fritz was sitting next to you. He was crying too. Everyone in the car was crying. When you arrived at Friedland camp, it was the end of October. Here registration would be done. Health checks would be done. Your families would be notified. At the camp entrance was a crowd. Journalists, photographers, cameras, lights. They were filming you. You were the last prisoners returning from Stalingrad. It was a historic moment. You fled from the cameras because you didn't want to be seen. This man wasn't you. The real you had remained in Stalingrad. At the health check, the doctor examined you. Your weight was 30 kilos short. Most of your teeth were gone. Your toes were cut off. Your lungs were damaged. Your liver was enlarged. Your kidneys were weakened. It wasn't a miracle you had survived. The miracle was you were still standing. The doctor shook his head, prescribed antibiotics, said you needed to stay in the hospital. But you refused. You wanted to go home. You wanted to see your mother and father. You wanted to tell them you were still alive. At the beginning of November, you boarded the train. This time, you were traveling inside Germany. From the window, you saw cities, rebuilt buildings, working factories, living people. Germany had been destroyed, but had risen. Had lost the war, but survived, like you. When you arrived at your hometown, there was no one at the station, because no one knew you were coming. You couldn't send a letter, couldn't make a phone call, couldn't send word. You just came. You walked through the streets. Everything looked different, but at the same time familiar. Here was the street where your house was. Here was your neighbor's garden. Here was the park you played in as a child. Your feet were carrying you automatically. You stopped in front of your house's door. You couldn't dare to knock on the door. What if they no longer lived there? What if they had moved? What if they had died? You raised your hand, knocked your fist on the door. Footsteps came from inside. The door opened. Your mother stood at the door. She couldn't recognize you, because you were no longer her son. You were an old man, an exhausted man, a man like a ghost. "Yes," she said. When you heard her voice, your throat knotted. "Mother," you said. "It's me." The woman's eyes widened. Her hand went to her mouth. Her knees buckled. "No," she said. "It can't be. You died," they told us. "I didn't die," you said. I returned. As Mother collapsed to the ground, you caught her. You embraced her. After 12 years, for the first time you were embracing a human. Your mother's smell, the texture of her hair, her body's warmth were real. It wasn't a dream. You were alive. You were home. You had returned. Your father was notified. He came. When he saw you, he cried. Men didn't cry, but that day your father cried. Your brother had married, had a child. You saw your niece. She was a small girl. She looked at you, was scared, hid behind her mother. You found it normal. You too were afraid of yourself. At dinner in the evening, you couldn't sit at the table because you weren't accustomed to sitting in a chair. You preferred to sit on the floor. When you saw food, you couldn't eat. Your stomach wasn't accustomed. You only ate bread, drank a sip of water. Your family was watching you. They wanted to talk, but you couldn't talk. Words weren't coming. There was only silence. At night, you lay in bed. It was a real bed, a soft bed. There was a blanket. There was a pillow. But you couldn't sleep because it was too quiet. There were no barrack sounds, coughs, groans, death rattles. Here there was only silence. It was terrifying. Days passed. You were going to the doctor, getting treatment, trying to recover. But your body wasn't healing. 12 years was too long. The damage was permanent. Your left foot would never get better. Your lungs would never return to normal. Your kidneys would never return to their old state. The doctor said, "You'll live a few years, maybe 5, maybe 10, but not much." You accepted. You were already living on borrowed time for 12 years. You met with the 6,000 prisoners who returned from the camp. You found Fritz again. You came together, talked, shared your memories. You were all asking the same question. Why us? Why did we survive? Of 90, 1,000 prisoners, 85,000 died. Most died in the first winter months from freezing, hunger, disease. 6,000 people remained. 6,000 miracles. You were one of them. One day, your mother asked, "What did you experience there?" You couldn't tell, because words weren't enough. No word could tell Stalingrad. No sentence could tell the cars, the camps, the dead. You just remained silent. Mother understood. She didn't ask more. Years passed. Germany was rebuilt. The economy recovered. People forgot. Stalingrad was forgotten. Prisoners were forgotten. The dead were forgotten. Only you remembered. Every night in sleep you saw your friends, Klaus, Werner, the man who died on the train, the old soldier who died in the barrack, the young soldier who froze in the forest. They were looking at you, asking why did you leave them and go. You had no answer. In 1960, you died. You had a heart attack. It was brief, not painful. It just ended. On your grave they wrote, "Stalingrad prisoner." You were one of 6,000 prisoners who returned to their families. You lived 9 years in Germany, but actually, you never returned. Your soul had remained in Siberia, had remained in Stalingrad, had remained on snowy plains. Today, in the city of Volgograd, there is a monument dedicated to soldiers who died in the Battle of Stalingrad. From both sides, German, Soviet, Romanian, Italian, 2 million people died there. 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. 85,000 died in camps. Only 6,000 returned. You were one of them. The survivor. The one who didn't forget. Who couldn't forget. And the story ends here. But in reality, it never ended. Because you're still there. On snowy plains, in frozen forests, in dark cars. You're still there. You'll stay there forever.